Well, welcome to The Catholic Reason, a radio show produced by St. Michael Catholic Radio, where we think through various claims made by the Catholic Church concerning issues of faith, morality, and culture, and provide some reasons behind those claims. Hence the title of the show, The Catholic Reason. My name is Carlo Broussard, and I'm a staff apologist and speaker for Catholic Answers at Catholic.com, and a member of the Chancery Evangelization Team at the Diocese of Tulsa in Eastern Oklahoma. Thank you so much for joining me this week. If you're a first-time listener, welcome. If you're a returning listener, welcome back. Thanks for joining me. So given that this episode is airing during Easter week, I figured it would be fitting for us to look at the Christian claim that Jesus bodily rose from the dead. And not just bodily rose from the dead, but bodily rose from the dead in a glorified state, the glorious bodily resurrection of Jesus. And that's a key detail as will become apparent as we go through today's episode. Now, skeptics have no shortage of objections to this Christian claim. Many times, such objections are posed in the form of alternative theories to Jesus' bodily resurrection that attempt to explain many of the gospel details surrounding Jesus' alleged resurrection, namely the empty tomb, the alleged post-mortem appearances of Jesus, and the early Christian belief that Jesus rose from the dead. And that is assuming the Christian apology or the Christian defense of the resurrection of Jesus. A sketch of that sort of approach, you basically look at certain gospel details, circumstantial details surrounding the alleged resurrection of Jesus, and I just listed a few of them: the empty tomb, the alleged post-mortem appearances, the early Christian belief that Jesus rose, and we offer the best explanation of those details. The Christian explanation, the Christian hypothesis that best explains those circumstantial details is the literal, bodily, and glorified resurrection of Jesus Christ. But then skeptics will counter and offer alternative explanations concerning those circumstantial details, alternative explanations for those details, saying, hey, look, the Christian hypothesis, the Christian explanation is not the only one. We can explain those details in other ways that don't require Jesus rising from the dead. And so that's kind of the approach and how this dialectic goes. Now, the three alternative theories or explanations to the Christian explanation of Jesus' bodily resurrection that we're going to look at today are, number one, the conspiracy theory, the idea that the apostles stole the body and lied about Jesus' resurrection. The hallucination and vision theory. Now, these are two distinct theories, but the answers to these theories apply to both. So we're going to kind of lump these two theories together, the hallucination theory and the vision theory, constituting sort of our second alternative explanation. And then thirdly, the apparent death theory, that Jesus apparently died, didn't really die. And if you don't have a dead Jesus, right? If Jesus didn't die, well, then guess what? You ain't got a resurrection. It's as simple as that. And so although there are four total here, again, we're lumping the hallucination and vision theory together. So basically sort of three alternative theories. So let's get started with the conspiracy theory. And what I'm going to share here is essentially what I explain in my article for Catholic Answers Magazine Online entitled, Why the Resurrection Was Not a Conspiracy. So I'm just going to share the details of that article with you here. In case you don't have time to go and get the article and read it yourself, you can just listen to it or watch it if you're watching via YouTube here. Because the radio show is video recorded, and if you're ever interested in just watching via YouTube, I'm just sitting here by myself in the studio talking to you. But if you want to watch for whatever reason, you can go to the Diocese of Tulsa YouTube page, and you can watch the video version of the radio show there. And also that brings to mind We do have a podcast version of the show. So if you ever want to go back and listen to previous episodes that we've done in prior weeks, you can just search The Catholic Reason in any podcast search engine that you use, or you can go specifically to the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcast, and the podcast is hosted there. And then you can also listen and download the podcast on my website at carlobroussard.com. Just click the audio tab and you'll see The Catholic Reason there under the audio tab. All right, so let's get to the conspiracy theory. Now, again, this theory purports to explain Christ's empty tomb and postmortem appearances by claiming the early Christians stole the body and made up the resurrection theory, made up the resurrection story. Remember how I said part of the approach, part of the defense for the Christian is trying to explain certain circumstantial details, right, that the Gospels report to us. The empty tomb and these alleged postmortem appearances. Christians say, we can explain that by Jesus' bodily resurrection. The conspiracy theory is going to say, no, we can offer an alternative explanation of those details, the empty tomb, postmortem appearances, by saying the apostles stole the body, that explains the empty tomb, and they lied about the postmortem appearances, that they saw Jesus. Now, I don't want to fault anyone for raising the question because it's natural to ask, did the early Christians make this stuff up? That is a good question to ask, and by no means do I want to devalue that question in my responses here. But ultimately, I'm going to argue here, as I do in my article, that they did not make this stuff up, and we have very good reasons to think that they did not make this stuff up, and so therefore good reasons to reject the conspiracy theory. Now, we could probably go through 11 different reasons as to why the conspiracy theory fails as an alternative explanation, but I'm just going to share with you two here in today's episode. The first reason is this: the early Christians had nothing to gain and everything to lose in lying about Jesus' resurrection. This is often called by scholars the apostolic dilemma. And this provides the idea that you have nothing to gain and everything to lose. That makes for the most credible witness. Whenever you have a witness testifying to something and they got nothing to gain, everything to lose, that gives us good reason to believe their testimony. That gives us good reason to think they're a credible testimony. And St. Paul actually understood this. And St. Paul himself uses this very fact, nothing to gain, everything to lose, to argue for the credibility of the early Christian testimony, and presents his argument in the form of a two-horned dilemma there in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And so we're going to just rip off of St. Paul here in constructing an argument for the credibility of the early Christian testimony that Jesus rose from the dead. So here's what he writes in verses 14 through 15 of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Paul writes this: if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching that he has been raised is in vain, and your faith is in vain. We are even found to be misrepresenting God, because we testified of God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if it is true that the dead are not raised. So that's the first horn of the dilemma. St. Paul presents the second horn in verse 19, and I'm going to explain that first horn articulated by Paul in verses 14 through 15 in a moment, so just hang tight. So now let's just establish the second horn of the dilemma in verse 19, and then he expounds on it in verses 30 through 32. So here's what he writes in verse 19: if for this life only we have hoped in Christ, we are of all men most to be pitied. Right? And then he goes on in 30 through 32. Why am I in peril every hour? I protest, brethren, by my pride in you, which I have in Christ Jesus our Lord, I die every day. What do I gain if, humanly speaking, I fought with beasts at Ephesus? If the dead are not raised, and that implies if Jesus is not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Okay, so let's try to unpack this. Notice the first horn that was there in verses 14 through 15. St. Paul argues that if he and the witnesses to the resurrection, everybody going around claiming Jesus rose from the dead, if he and the witnesses believed in God, well, then they would be bearing false witness in their proclamation of Jesus' resurrection. Notice how he says, we are even found to be misrepresenting God, okay? So if they're going around lying about this stuff, and they believe that God exists, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who gave them the Ten Commandments, they would be misrepresenting God. They would be bearing false witness. Now think about it. This is a good question. What would the early Christians have to gain from a lie while still believing in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? What would they have to gain from that? Damnation, right? And so you have to ask the question, is it reasonable to think the early Christians believed their eternal salvation was worth risking for a lie? That doesn't make sense. If they were believers in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which Paul is affirming they are, well, then it wouldn't be good for them to be lying, because that would only bring about damnation for them, especially lying about something so important as Jesus rising from the dead. So if they're believers in God, they don't have anything to gain, and they have everything to lose, namely their eternal salvation. So as believers in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it's not going to be beneficial to go about lying about this stuff. Now, in the second horn, St. Paul is going to reflect upon the consequences for a lie if they don't believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And what he goes on to say is that they have nothing to gain and everything to lose, even if they are unbelievers. But then skeptics will counter that Christian hypothesis or explanation with alternative explanations for the details that Christians are trying to explain. And the one that we were beginning to consider before the break is what is known as the conspiracy theory, the idea that the apostles stole the body of Jesus from the tomb, thus explaining the empty tomb, and lied about the postmortem appearances of Jesus, thus explaining the alleged postmortem appearances. They go around saying how Jesus appeared to them. Well, this theory says that the apostles were just simply lying about that stuff. And so we began to offer a reason why the conspiracy theory does not work and why it's not a reasonable theory or explanation concerning the empty tomb, for the empty tomb, and the postmortem appearances, the alleged postmortem appearances of Jesus. And the first reason we began to give was that the early Christians had nothing to gain and everything to lose in lying about Jesus' resurrection, what scholars call the apostolic dilemma, looking to St. Paul's very argument in 1 Corinthians 15 and presenting this two-horn dilemma, the first horn being, hey, listen, if we're believers in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we have nothing to gain and everything to lose in lying about Jesus' resurrection. We have nothing to gain because we're just going to be mocked and scorned and killed for it. And we have everything to lose if we're lying about this stuff, because as believers in God, we're going to be damned, right? The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is going to damn us. And so it doesn't make sense that these first century Jews would be willing to risk their eternal salvation and living forever with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob for the sake of a lie, right? The lying about Jesus' resurrection. That was the first horn. So St. Paul saying, hey, listen, if we're believers, this doesn't make sense for us to lie. The second horn, St. Paul seems to consider what they might gain from the lie if they were unbelievers and didn't believe in God or the resurrection, right? Notice in verse 19, he writes, if for this life only we have hoped in Christ. And then in verse 32, what do I gain if, humanly speaking, I fought with beasts at Ephesus? Paul's argument is that nothing except persecution and death is to be gained for such a lie. For Paul, if this is the reward, then we might as well, as he says, eat and drink, for tomorrow we die, right? If there is nothing to gain from lying about Jesus' resurrection as unbelievers, nothing to gain and everything to lose, what do they have to lose? Their entire life, right? Their social status, their credibility, and even their life. That's what they have to lose. And there's nothing to gain from the lie. Well, then, by golly, we might as well eat, drink, and for tomorrow we die. There's no sense in lying about Jesus' resurrection when there's nothing to gain and everything to lose. So, since there's nothing for Paul and the apostles to gain about lying about the resurrection, we can be certain that they're at least sincere and thereby not lying. And one note here, one thing to note is the emphasis on nothing to gain for the lie. Some people will only focus on they have everything to lose for the lie. And normally, some people will just say people don't die for what they know to be a lie. And I, in fact, used to think this. I used to just simply argue no one dies for what they know to be a lie. But then, I'll be honest, I was watching an episode of Blue Bloods on CBS. And, it's a show about a Catholic family. They're all police and somehow affiliated with the police department, and they investigate crimes, etc. And in one of the episodes, there was a father who was on death row for a crime. And it came out in the episode that he was innocent, but he was taking the fall for his daughter in order to keep his daughter alive. So there it dawned on me as I was watching that episode that he was dying for what he knew to be a lie. And so it's not sufficient to just simply say people don't die for what they know to be a lie, but you have to articulate the idea that people normally don't die for a lie when there's nothing to gain from it. In that episode, the father had something to gain, namely saving his daughter's life. And that's a laudable intention, at least, but he was just going about it in the wrong way. And so people will die for a lie when there's something to gain, but people don't die for a lie when there's nothing to gain. And that's Paul's point in 1 Corinthians 15. Listen, as unbelievers, man, there is nothing to gain from this sort of a lie. And so why would we even be going around saying it, if it were a lie? That doesn't make sense. And so given that the apostles, Paul and the apostles and the early Christian testimony, there was nothing for them to gain and everything to lose, they're credible witnesses. And that gives us good reason to at least think that they are sincere. And if they are sincere, and we have good reason to think so, well, then we have good reason to reject the conspiracy theory. So that's reason number one. The second reason why we should reject the conspiracy theory is because the gospel writers include women as the first witnesses. Now, before you start throwing the stones, ladies, if you're listening to me, hang tight there. Let me try and explain something here. One of the many criteria historians use to test historicity is the criterion of embarrassment. Now, this refers to any action or saying the early Christians would have found embarrassing and apologetically unappealing. Some detail that would have worked against them, right? No gospel writer would want to include that kind of information because it would undermine the purpose of the gospel. Having women as the first witnesses to the resurrection fits the bill for such a criterion. In the first century, for first century Judaism, having women as a first witness of the resurrection would actually work against your story for credibility purposes. In first century Judaism, again, the testimony of women was inadmissible, specifically in the court of law, and we have evidence for this. So here's some evidence that the testimony of women would not be desired. This comes from the first century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus in his work Antiquities of the Jews in Book 4. He writes, "But let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex." So think about it. If a woman's testimony was not considered credible in a court of law, it would seem that the apostles would not use the testimony of women to convince their hearers about the truth of the empty tomb and the appearances of the resurrected Christ. It's more reasonable to think that if the gospel writers were fabricating this story, they would have chosen men to be the first witnesses, perhaps Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, not women. But they do include women as the first witnesses to the empty tomb and the resurrected Christ. And so therefore, it doesn't make sense that they would be fabricating this story or lying about it. The lying hypothesis does not jibe with the historical detail of women being the first witnesses of the empty tomb and the appearances of the resurrected Christ. Now, there are some skeptics who might counter along the lines of atheist activist and historian Richard Carrier. In chapter 11 of his book, Not the Impossible Faith, he objects to this appeal to women, and he proposes two arguments here. He argues that because the Gospels are history and not court documents, it's improper for the Christian apologist to go from courtroom decorum to everyday credibility. Because remember, we quoted Josephus, which gives evidence why the testimony of women was not admitted in the court of law. So Carrier responds and says, hey, that's courtroom decorum, and you can't go from courtroom to everyday credibility, which is what you need for the testimony of women concerning the empty tomb and the resurrected Jesus. And furthermore, Carrier contends, while the testimony of women was not accepted in the court of law, it was admissible as a source for historical claims. And Carrier appeals to Josephus's account of the massacres of Gamala and Masada, both of which have two women as their sources. So the idea here is that, hey, we got historical evidence that women were sources, and their testimony was included or used as valid sources to verify a certain event outside of the boundaries of the courtroom. And so how do we respond to Carrier here? Well, our response, remember, there's two arguments. He says you can't go from courtroom to everyday credibility. And then secondly, he's saying, hey, the testimony of women was admissible as a source for historical claims. So here's my response. I got two responses to the first argument of Carrier. Number one, the apostles are making an apology here. They're making a defense of the resurrection of Jesus. And that's the type of argumentation that would be employed within the courtroom. And so it's legitimate for a Christian apologist to use the inadmissibility of women's testimony in the court of law. Again, because the gospel writers are making an apologetic case to convince their hearers of the truth of the resurrection. It's a courtroom-like argument. They weren't merely recounting a historical event, but they're presenting a convergence of evidence for the truth of Jesus' resurrection. The truth of the empty tomb, the multiple postmortem appearances, conversions, etc., all of those details being adequately explained by the literal bodily resurrection of Jesus. So given that apologetic style of argumentation and case, which is the sort of case you would make within a courtroom, a response to atheist activist Richard Carrier, who counters the Christian apologists' appeal to the testimony of women being the first witnesses of the empty tomb and the appearances of the resurrected Christ. The Christian apologist says that's an embarrassing detail that the gospel writers would not include if they were lying about this stuff. Richard Carrier counters and says, hey, wait a minute. The inadmissibility of the testimony of women was only within courtrooms. We're dealing here in the gospel narratives with everyday historical claims and credibility, and you can't infer or jump from courtroom decorum to everyday credibility. That was the first argument that Carrier gives as a counter response to our appeal to the testimony of women. And before the break, I was beginning to respond to Carrier's counter by saying, hey, look, the gospel writers aren't merely making a historical claim. They're actually constructing an apology or a defense for Jesus' resurrection. They're presenting a convergence of evidence for the truth of Jesus' resurrection, the empty tomb, the multiple postmortem appearances, conversions, etc. And that is the type of case that one would make within the boundaries of a courtroom. So given the apologetic nature of the early Christian testimony, it would be okay and appropriate for the Christian apologist to appeal to the inadmissibility of the testimony of women. The gospel writers include their testimony. Given the apologetical nature of the case that they're making, then it's reasonable to say the gospel writers would not include the testimony of women as witnesses of the empty tomb and the resurrected Christ if they were making this stuff up. Now, a second response to Carrier's first argument here is notice that when we appeal to Josephus as evidence for the inadmissibility of the testimony of women, notice the reason why Josephus says the testimony of women would not be admissible in the court of law. He says, on account of the levity and boldness of their sex. The word levity means to treat a serious matter with humor or in a manner of lacking due respect. So while this view of women might not lead to an utter dismissal of a woman's testimony, it would surely make such a testimony less desirable if one is fabricating a story, especially when it's just as easy to use men as the first witnesses. So those are a couple of responses. These are ways in which we could respond to Carrier's first argument, that argument being you can't move from the courtroom decorum to everyday credibility. We have good reason to say, yes, you can, given the apologetical nature of the case that the gospel writers are making concerning the resurrection of Jesus, and the reason why first century Jews would not admit the testimony of a woman given the levity of their sex. So that provides reason why the gospel readers would not include the testimony of women if they were lying about this stuff. Okay, so the second argument that Carrier gave as a counter response was that Josephus's account of the massacre of Gamala and Masada, he used women as sources to verify these events. And so in response, we can say, well, listen, that doesn't count against the apologist's appeal to the testimony of women in the gospel narratives, because Josephus admits these women's testimony for the massacres because they were the only ones available, right? So in reference to the slaughter of Gamala, Josephus states that the two women who served as his sources were the only ones who escaped the massacre. And that's in his Wars of the Jews, Book 4. So while not explicit when recounting the massacre at Masada, Josephus seems to imply the two women were his only two sources. They were his sources for that event because they were the sole survivors. And that he also talks about in the Wars of the Jews in Book 7. So it's obvious Josephus is going to use the testimony of women for these events since no one else survived. So with that in mind, it's easy to see why Carrier's appeal to Josephus's reliance on these women doesn't undermine the Christian argument here. The gospel writers had options when deciding whom to place as witnesses of Christ's resurrection. But Josephus didn't have any options when considering on whose testimony to base his account of the massacres. So there's a disanalogous parallel here. Christian gospel writers had options. They could have used men, Joseph of Arimathea, if they were making this stuff up. Josephus didn't have other options, okay? So the unreliability of the testimony of women in first century Judaism still stands as a legitimate case of the criterion of embarrassment, and thus can be used by Christian apologists and Christians in general when making the case for the historicity of Jesus' resurrection. So the bottom line is, since they use the testimony of women, they're not lying about this stuff. Now, there are many more reasons that we could give to show the conspiracy theory is unreasonable, but I think the two that we've presented here are sufficient. Namely, people don't die for what they know to be a lie when there is nothing to gain and everything to lose. And liars don't use unreliable testimonies to convince their audience of their fabricated stories. So in this Easter season, the Christian can rest assured that faith in the resurrected Jesus is at least not based on a lie. With the conspiracy theory now out of the way, let's turn to the hallucination and vision theories. Remember, I'm lumping them together because the answers that we're going to give in response are the same for both. So it's no use, going through reasons against the hallucination theory and then going through those same reasons against the vision theories. The reasons are the same. The answers are the same. The critiques are the same. So we're just going to lump them together. And again, the answers that I'll give here are found in an article that I wrote for Catholic Answers Magazine online entitled The Resurrection, Hallucination or Vision. So again, just to sort of set the stage, critics of Christianity will appeal to subjective experiences. That's what's common to both the vision theory and the hallucination theory. These are merely subjective experiences that the Christians had. And so skeptics will appeal to these kinds of subjective experiences to try and explain the resurrection of Jesus. Now, again, some argue that the postmortem appearances of Jesus were hallucinations. So that's the target. That's the detail that's trying to be explained here. Postmortem appearances. That's explained, so it's said, by hallucinations. Others argue that the appearances were merely visions of the dead Jesus, similar to the movie of The Sixth Sense, right? In which a boy, Cole Sear, says, "I see dead people." So maybe these are just subjective visions that they're having, nothing objective there. And so the question becomes, are these reasonable suggestions? And I answer that although the theories could possibly explain the alleged appearances of Jesus, they fall short in accounting for other crucial facts, thereby giving us reason to reject the hallucination and vision theories. And I'm going to offer 4 critiques here. I'm not going to be able to get through all 4 before we come up on the break, but let's see how far we can go here. The first is that the hallucination vision theories fail to explain the empty tomb, right? For a thorough defense of the historical reliability of the empty tomb, we don't have time for that, but I would recommend that you check out Dr. William Lane Craig's book, The Sun Rises, The Historical Evidence for the Resurrection of Jesus. There in chapter 3, he goes through a litany of reasons why the empty tomb is a historically reliable fact. But here's the argument. If the Christians were hallucinating or having visions of Jesus, well, then the skeptics could have easily produced the body. Think about it. Jesus was a popular preacher and was placed in a tomb that belonged to a high-ranking official of the Sanhedrin, Joseph of Arimathea. Okay, he was a Jewish leader. So this makes it reasonable to conclude that the location of Jesus' tomb would have been known, thus making it easy to prove the tomb was empty and falsify the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. But of course, this didn't happen. The skeptics to the Christian claim, the deniers of the Christian claim, could not produce the body. If the hallucination and vision theories were true, they could have produced the body, but they didn't produce the body, and so therefore we can conclude the hallucination and vision theories are not true. They fail as an adequate explanation of all of the circumstantial details. They only explain the alleged postmortem appearances. They do not explain the empty tomb. Second critique, the hallucination and vision theories fail to explain the diversity of Jesus' appearances. All right, so the multitude of appearances to different people on different occasions. So not just different people, but appearing to different people on different occasions. So Mary Magdalene, for example, in Mark 16:9, the women at the tomb in Luke 24:10, Peter himself in 1 Corinthians 15:5, James in 1 Corinthians 15:7. He appeared to the 12. Check out 1 Corinthians 15:5. And he appeared to the 12 on many different occasions in the upper room on the night of the resurrection, according to John 20:19 through 23, on the seashore, according to John 21. He appeared to them for a succession of 40 days. He was with them on many different occasions, right? According to Acts 1:3. And he appeared to them on the Mount of Olives before his ascension, according to Matthew 28:18 through 20. St. Paul writes that Jesus appeared even to 500 plus brethren at the same time, many of whom were still alive when Paul penned his letter and recorded that detail in 1 Corinthians 15:6. And he actually challenged those reading the letter, hey, if you don't believe me, you can verify it with those who are still alive and ask them. And so ask yourself the question, how can so many people hallucinate the same thing or have the same vision at different times and in different places and draw from it the same erroneous conclusion? It doesn't make sense, which the Christian explanation of the resurrection of Jesus succeeds in explaining, right? Now, there's a second reason why we can reject the hallucination and vision theories, which we began to articulate before the break, and that is they fail to explain the diversity of Jesus's appearances. Jesus appearing to many different people at many different times on different occasions, doing different things. And we started asking the question, how can so many different people hallucinate the same thing or have the same vision at different times and in different places and draw from it the same erroneous conclusion. That would be that Jesus rose from the dead. It doesn't make sense. Now, with respect to hallucinations, clinical psychologist Gary Collins explains the following in a personal correspondence with scholar Gary Habermas in his article explaining away Jesus' resurrection, the recent revival of hallucination theories in the Christian Research Journal, volume 23 in 2001. Psychologist Collins explains the following. Hallucinations are individual occurrences. By their very nature, only one person can see a given hallucination at a time. They certainly are not something which can be seen by a group of people. And you should be thinking there how St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that 500 plus Christian brethren saw the resurrected Christ. That's a detail that would conflict with what this clinical psychologist Gary Collins is saying. Collins continues, since a hallucination exists only in this subjective personal sense, it is obvious that others cannot witness it. And so the bottom line here is that the circumstantial detail of Jesus' resurrection, namely that Jesus appeared to many different people on different occasions doing different things, conflicts with the hallucination hypothesis. And we could even say the vision theory. Given that vision theories are subjective personal experiences, it is unlikely that they would all be experiencing the same thing and drawing from it the same conclusions. Now, there's another reason why we should reject the hallucination and vision theories, and that is they fail to explain the bodily nature of the resurrected Jesus. The hallucination and vision theories don't take into account the unique, the bodily visions or the bodily experiences. There it is. Sorry about that. I was trying to get it out. The bodily experiences of Jesus post-mortem, right after his death and his alleged resurrection. So, for example, he ate with his disciples 2 times on the seashore, according to John 21, 14 through 15. And he ate in the home with the 2 disciples traveling on the road to Emmaus, as recorded by Luke in Luke 24, 28 through 30. It's implied that Mary Magdalene held on to the resurrected Jesus when he told her, "Don't hold me," in John 20:17. And Jesus even invited the apostle Thomas to touch his wounds from his crucifixion, as recorded by John chapter 20, verse 27. So if you think about the bodily nature of the encounters the apostles and others had with the resurrected Jesus, that doesn't map on with these hallucination and vision theories. Hallucinations and visions don't eat food, and they can't be touched, folks, right? Christian apologist Dr. William Lane Craig sees this bodily experience of Jesus as sufficient evidence against the subjective experience theories, namely the hallucination and vision theories. He writes this in his book, The Sun Rises, The Historical Evidence for the Resurrection of Jesus. He says, "There's no trace of non-physical appearances in the sources. A remarkable fact if all the appearances were really hallucinations or visionary, as some critics would have us believe. That strongly suggests that the appearances were not, in fact, hallucinations or visions, but actual bodily appearances." So the bodily nature of Jesus' appearances militates against the hallucination and vision theories. Now, the hallucination and vision theories also fail to explain the glorious nature of the bodily appearances of Jesus, right? So it's not just that the gospel narratives report to us that Jesus appeared bodily, but that he was present there bodily in a glorified manner. There are certain unique characteristics that Jesus's body had after the resurrection. So, for example, John records in John 20:19 that the doors are locked and there Jesus appeared to them. So apparently Jesus in his resurrected body walked through the doors. So his resurrected body is not limited by the confines of matter. Luke 24:31, Jesus disappears from the disciples as he's eating with them, those disciples on the road to Emmaus. Now, according to St. Thomas Aquinas, that's a manifestation of the gift of agility. And given that it's a body, the body has to move from point A to point B and go through space, but does so swiftly that it seems as if the body is appearing and disappearing. And then apparently Jesus seemingly changed his countenance or his appearance with those same two disciples on the road to Emmaus. According to Luke 24, they did not recognize him. And that's interesting because they were a part of Jesus's ministry. They were following Jesus, so you would think they would recognize who Jesus is, right? But they didn't. So apparently Jesus in his resurrected body was able to transform himself in some way to where they weren't able to recognize him. Now think about it. Here's the argument. If these appearances of the resurrected Jesus were hallucinations, well, then the glorious nature of Jesus' resurrected body, such as freedom from the limitations of matter and the ability to swiftly go from point A to point B to seeming like he's disappearing, they would had to have been a part, these unique characteristics would had to have been a part of the mental framework of the apostles, since hallucinations cannot exceed the content of an individual's mind. But such a glorified state would have been foreign to the disciples' minds. That would not have been within the mental framework of the disciples. And thus, they would have been unable to project it onto reality, which is what a hallucination is. They couldn't have received it, the idea of these unique characteristics, they couldn't have received it from Jewish theology, since the Jewish conception of resurrection was a return to the same kind of bodily life as before death. Such as Lazarus in John chapter 11. An Anglican scholar, New Testament scholar, N.T. Wright, points this out in his book, The Resurrection of the Son of God. So the apostles couldn't have got these ideas of unique characteristics from Jewish theology. And paganism also fails as a possible source for this belief, to have it in their mental framework to project onto reality, because pagans at the time didn't even have a conception of a bodily resurrection. So for this reason, the hallucination theory fails. And furthermore, visions of dead people were common in the first century. And so the idea here is that the apostles wouldn't have concluded with a resurrection, and a glorious resurrection at that, simply from a vision. Why would something so common, such as visions of dead people, lead the apostles to think something so different? Namely, that Jesus was the Messiah and Lord, raised from the dead, not only in a bodily way, but a bodily and glorious state. If anything, they would have thought Jesus was merely a favored prophet of God, taken up into heaven like Enoch or Elijah, and was simply appearing to them from there. But that's not what they preached. They preached the literal, glorious resurrection of the God-man, Jesus Christ. So, given what we've said here in these four reasons, I think we can reasonably rule out the hallucination and vision theories when trying to account for the apostles' claim that they saw the resurrected Jesus. Okay, so that takes care of the conspiracy theory and the hallucination and vision theories. Now, I mentioned at the outset of today's episode that we would look at a third alternative explanation, namely the apparent death theory. We're not going to have time in today's episode to get through all of it. So what I'm going to do is we'll start thinking through, and I'll give maybe one critique for this apparent death theory, but we're going to save the rest of it for next week. In fact, actually, as I'm looking at the clock here, we're not even going to have time to get into the first critique. And basically, the apparent death theory says that Jesus only apparently died. He didn't really die on the cross. And so that when they took him down, they put him in the tomb, he came to consciousness, presented himself to the apostles, and the apostles thereby concluded Jesus rose from the dead. That's the apparent death theory. Next week, in next week's episode, we're going to start off with this theory, and we're going to show the reasons why it's unreasonable. So that does it for this week's episode of The Catholic Reason. The Catholic claim is that the conspiracy theory, the hallucination, and vision theories are not successful in explaining the relevant details surrounding the alleged resurrection of Jesus. Again, we're going to look at some other theories in our next week's episode, so be on the lookout. Be sure to listen then. And I want to thank you for listening to The Catholic Reason today. Again, a production of St. Michael Catholic Radio. You can download the show through whichever podcast platform you use by subscribing to the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcast. You can also access the archived episodes at carlobroussard.com under the audio tab. Join me again next week as we continue looking at Catholic claims and the reasons behind them. Tell a friend. I'll talk to you then. God bless you.